We're not paying for her meal. Separate bills, please. That was my daughter-in-law, Harriet, speaking to the young waiter as calmly as if she were ordering another glass of Sauvignon Blanc. My son Desmond sat across from her, eyes fixed on his menu, and when the waiter glanced at him for confirmation, he gave the faintest nod. Not a word to me, not a glance at his mother, who was sitting to my right, still clutching the little beaded handbag she'd saved for 18 months to buy. It was Mother's Day, the second Sunday in May. We were at the hunting lodge out in Waimauku, west of Auckland, because my son had booked it himself 3 weeks earlier and told my wife Enid it was her gift. I remember her ringing me at the workshop that afternoon, her voice bright as a schoolgirl's, saying, "Arthur, can you believe it? Desmond wants to take me to that restaurant with the pohutukawa trees, the one we saw in the magazine." She'd been in remission for 14 months then. Stage 3. Ovarian. 2 surgeries. 6 rounds of chemotherapy that took her hair and her appetite and most of her weight. And somehow, she'd come through it, still smiling. The doctor said the next 5 years would tell us everything. She'd bought a new dress for that dinner, pale blue with small white flowers, and she'd asked me 3 times whether it made her look too thin. I'd told her she looked beautiful, because she did, and because she was my wife of 41 years, and because on that Sunday morning I had no earthly idea what my own son was capable of. My name is Arthur Whitmore. I'm 67 years old. I was born in a weatherboard house in Pukekohe, south of Auckland, the only child of a dairy farmer and a school teacher. My father died of a heart attack when I was 19, and my mother followed him 6 years later, and between them they left me a modest block of land that I sold in 1988 to start a small cabinet-making business. By the time I was 50, Whitmore Joinery had 11 employees and a waiting list 6 months long. I built kitchens for some of the finest homes in Remuera and Herne Bay. I was never rich in the way some men are rich, but my wife and I paid off our house in Titirangi, put our only son through the University of Auckland, and never missed a bill. Desmond was born in 1989. He was the quiet, clever one in his classes, the boy teachers always described as thoughtful. He studied commerce and law, and when he graduated in 2013, he told me he wanted to start his own consultancy, a business that helped small firms with mergers and acquisitions. I asked him how much he needed. He said $200,000 would be a good start. I gave him $1.9 million. I know how that sounds. I know what every sensible person would say, but you have to understand, my wife's older brother had died the year before, a bachelor with no children, and he'd left the bulk of his estate to Enid, property in Devonport, shares in a forestry company, a little cottage up in Karakari. After the estate settled, we had more money than we'd ever imagined having, and Desmond was our only child. Enid and I talked about it for weeks. We were in our late 50s then. The business was steady. Our house was paid for. And we truly thought, that giving him his inheritance while we were still alive was the better thing to do. Help him build something, watch him grow it, be there for the victories instead of being a name in a will. So we signed it over. Every cent of it, except for the Karakari cottage, which Enid wanted to keep because she'd spent summers there as a girl. $1.9 million transferred to my son's account on a Tuesday morning in October 2014. He hugged me in the bank car park. He said, "Dad, I'll never forget this." He said he'd build something we could all be proud of. Harriet came along 18 months later. She was a property lawyer at one of the big firms in the CBD, 3 years older than Desmond, sharp as a scalpel and dressed head to toe in whatever the magazines said was in. The first time I met her, at a barbecue at our place in Titirangi, she asked Enid whether our house had ever been valued for subdivision potential. Enid laughed because she thought it was a joke. I knew it wasn't. They married in 2017 at a winery in Matakana. The wedding cost $140,000, and I paid for all of it. Because Harriet's parents had recently separated and her mother told me quietly at the engagement dinner that there simply wasn't anything left on her side. I didn't mind. She was my son's bride. I wanted her to have the day she'd dreamed of. Looking back, I should have noticed the pattern then. The gifts we bought that were never quite right. The visits that became less frequent. The Christmas in 2018 when Enid spent 3 days making a pavlova the way Desmond had loved it as a boy. And Harriet took one look at the dessert and said she didn't eat refined sugar. The birthday when we drove 2 hours to their new house in Herne Bay and found they'd booked a restaurant anyway, and Harriet spent most of the evening on her phone. But I told myself every couple has adjustments. I told myself my son was busy. I told myself Harriet had her own family wounds and needed time. Then, in January 2024, Enid found the lump. I'll spare you the worst of it. The diagnosis came on a Thursday. The surgery was scheduled for the following Monday. I rang Desmond from the hospital car park and told him his mother had cancer. There was a long silence on the line. Then he said, "Right. Do you need me to do anything?" I said I thought he might want to visit. He said he'd see what he could do with his schedule. He came to the hospital once, for 40 minutes. 2 days after the surgery, Harriet didn't come at all. They sent flowers and arrangements so large and so formal, it looked like something for a funeral, and a card that Harriet had clearly written because it was addressed to Mrs. Whitmore and signed Desmond and Harriet Whitmore. Enid kept the card on her bedside table for the entire hospital stay. She thought it was lovely. The chemotherapy took everything out of her. I closed the workshop for 3 months to be at home with her. I learned to cook the few things she could still keep down: plain congee, a weak chicken broth, scrambled eggs with a pinch of salt. I slept in a chair beside her bed because she was afraid at night. And I read to her from a battered copy of Janet Frame's stories that she'd had since she was 22. During those 3 months, Desmond rang 4 times. Twice to ask for advice about a client dispute. Once to tell us he and Harriet were going to Queenstown for a long weekend. And once, in March, to say he'd been thinking and he wondered whether, given the medical bills, it might be the right time to put the Titirangi house in his name. For estate planning reasons. He used those exact words. Estate planning reasons. While my wife was lying in the next room, too weak to sit up. I told him no. He didn't ring again for 6 weeks. The business was struggling by then. I'd been away too long. 2 of my best cabinet makers had taken other jobs. The waiting list had shrunk to nothing. I was 66. My wife was fighting for her life, and I was watching 40 years of work quietly dissolve because I hadn't been there to hold it together. By the end of 2024, Enid was in remission. By March 2026, the business was winding down to just me and 1 part-time apprentice named Ngaire. The savings we'd kept aside, the bit that wasn't the inheritance, had gone to medical co-pays, private specialists, a second opinion in Australia that turned out to matter. The Karakari cottage had been sold the previous winter because the roof needed replacing, and we couldn't afford both that and Enid's follow-up scans. We had the house. We had my superannuation. We had just enough, if we were careful, to keep going. I never told Desmond any of this. I never asked him for $1 of what I'd given him. I had my pride. And I had the belief stubborn. I'll admit that one day my son would remember who we were to him. Which brings me back to that Sunday at the hunting lodge. Enid had been talking about the restaurant for a week. She'd chosen her dress. She'd had her hair done at a little salon in New Lynn because it was growing back fine and gray, and she wanted it to look its best. When we arrived at 7:15, Desmond and Harriet were already seated at a table by the window, under a wooden beam hung with old hurricane lamps. Harriet stood to kiss the air beside Enid's cheek. Desmond hugged his mother briefly and shook my hand. "You look well, Mum," he said. I feel well, Enid said. And I saw the light in her eyes, and I thought foolishly, quietly, perhaps this is the start of something better. The waiter came around and took our drinks. Harriet ordered a bottle of Pinot Noir from Central Otago, the most expensive one on the list. Enid asked for a sparkling water. I had a beer. Desmond chose a whiskey, which he'd never drunk before in my presence. Then the menus came, and Harriet looked across the table at my wife and said, Enid, you should really try the venison carpaccio. It's their signature. Enid smiled uncertainly. I'm not sure my stomach's up to raw meat these days, dear. Oh, of course, Harriet said, in the tone people use for small children. The chicken. Then, Enid ordered the chicken. I ordered the lamb shank. Desmond asked for the Wagyu sirloin at $89. Harriet ordered the market fish, the scallops to start, and a side of truffle chips. And that's when she turned to the young waiter, a Maori lad, perhaps 22. His name tag said Tan, and said the words, I will remember for whatever years I have left. We're not paying for her meal. Separate bills, please. Just Desmond and me together. And the parents on their own. Tan hesitated. He looked at Desmond. My son nodded. Then Harriet said, louder than she needed to, it's just that money's been tight for them since Arthur's business went quiet. And we don't want to leave them uncomfortable. It's more dignified this way. 3 tables around us went silent. A woman at the next table, blonde, in her 40s, dining with her own mother, put down her fork. Enid's face lost all its color. I watched my wife of 41 years, who had survived cancer twice and buried both her parents and her only brother, and worked as a midwife for 31 years, delivering babies at Middlemore Hospital. I watched her become small in her chair. I reached under the table and took her hand. It was shaking. Fine, I said to Tan. My voice was perfectly even. Separate bills. That's fine, Desmond said. Dad, it's just practical. I said nothing. I looked at him, and I held his eyes until he looked away. And I said nothing at all. The meal came. Enid ate perhaps 3 bites of her chicken. Harriet made conversation about a property she and Desmond were buying in Pakuranga, their 3rd investment property. She mentioned twice, and a holiday they'd booked in the Cook Islands for July. She asked Enid if she'd ever been. Enid said no. Harriet said, well, it's probably a bit much for someone in your condition anyway. I ate my lamb shank slowly. I chewed every mouthful. I listened to my daughter-in-law describe the villa she'd rented in Rarotonga while my wife pushed food around her plate and tried not to cry. And somewhere in the middle of that meal, somewhere between the scallops and the Wagyu sirloin, something in me changed. Not broke. Changed. A switch I hadn't known was there. Flipping quietly in the dark. When the bills came, Tan brought them on 2 separate trays. Desmond and Harriet's came to $440. Ours came to $98. I took out my wallet to pay. That's when the manager walked over. He was a man about my age, perhaps a little younger, with silver hair combed neatly back and a small greenstone pendant at his throat. He stopped at our table and stood very still for a moment, looking at me, and then at Enid. Excuse me, he said. Forgive me for interrupting. My name is Henare Paraon. I'm the manager here. He paused, and then he said, very quietly, Are you Arthur Whitmore? I said I was. Henare's face did something then, a small, deep thing. The kind of expression you only see on a man who has carried something for a long time. He said, Mr. Whitmore, would you mind standing for just one moment? I stood. I had no idea why. Henare turned to his staff, 3 waiters, including Tan, and 2 young women clearing a nearby table, and he said, loudly enough that the whole dining room could hear, This man saved my daughter's life. The room went perfectly silent. In June 1996, Hanar said, his voice very steady. My wife and I were driving back from Hamilton with our little girl, Mariana. She was 4 years old. A logging truck crossed the center line near Huntley and hit us head-on. My wife was killed at the scene. I was trapped in the wreckage with a collapsed lung. My daughter was in the back, still breathing but pinned, and the car was beginning to burn. He paused. I felt Enid's hand find mine again. The first man on the scene was a cabinetmaker driving home from a site visit. He had no training. He had no equipment. He had a crowbar from his work ute and his own 2 hands. He got my daughter out of the car 30 seconds before it caught fire. He stayed with her on the verge until the ambulance came. He kept her talking. He kept her breathing. Then he reached back into the wreckage and he pulled me out too. And he didn't leave either of us until the paramedics arrived. Hanari looked at me directly. Mr. Whitmore, I spent 29 years looking for you. The hospital wouldn't give me your name. You'd left before the police arrived, because you said you were just a bloke who'd done what anyone would do. My daughter grew up. Mr. Whitmore, she's a midwife now, up in Wangare. She has 2 children of her own. Her eldest is named Arthur, after the man her father told her about every birthday. I couldn't speak. I could feel Enid weeping quietly beside me. Hinari turned to my son and daughter-in-law. His voice changed then. Not louder, just harder, like a river freezing. I overheard your instruction to my waiter, he said. I want you to understand something. This restaurant will not serve your parents on a separate bill. Your parents' meal tonight is complimentary, as it would be any night they chose to come here. I would serve them from my own kitchen if we were closed. He looked at Harriet. And you, madam, will settle your own bill. And you will do so immediately. And you will never be welcome in this restaurant again. That applies to your husband as well. Harriet's face had gone the color of old paper. Desmond opened his mouth and closed it. Then Hanar did something I will never forget. He walked around the table to where Enid was sitting, and he bowed, actually bowed, a proper formal bow, and he said, Mrs. Whitmore, I am so very sorry for what you've been subjected to this evening. If you'll permit me, I'd like to bring you a slice of our pavlova, on the house, with a candle in it, because it is Mother's Day, and because you are the wife of the finest man I have ever met. Enid nodded. She couldn't speak. The dining room erupted, not in shouting, in the strange, spontaneous way a room of strangers does when something true has happened in front of them. People stood. The blonde woman at the next table was crying openly. An old Pakaha gentleman in the corner raised his glass to me without a word. A young couple near the door began clapping, and then others joined, and then the whole restaurant was on its feet. Desmond and Harriet sat frozen in their chairs. Harriet fumbled her card across the table to Ton. Desmond, still, couldn't look at me. The pavlova came. Enid blew out the candle. We stayed another 20 minutes, and people kept coming over quietly to shake my hand, to kiss Enid on the cheek, to tell us we were in the right place tonight. A woman from Waimauku who'd been eating alone gave Enid a small enamel pin shaped like a pohutukawa flower and said, I'm a breast cancer survivor. 12 years. You keep going, love. When we finally left, Hanari walked us to the car park. The air smelled of damp grass and sea salt. He shook my hand for a long time. My daughter is in Wangare tomorrow, he said. She finishes her shift at 4. I'd very much like for you to meet her. I said we would come. Enid and I drove home in silence for a long while. Then she said, quietly, Arthur, why didn't you ever tell me about that accident? I thought about it. I said, because there was nothing to tell, love. I did what any decent bloke would have done. It didn't need talking about. She was quiet again. Then she said, that's why I married you. We didn't see Desmond or Harriet for 11 days. On the 12th day, Desmond came to the house alone. It was a Wednesday afternoon, raining steadily, and he stood on the porch in a suit that had cost more than my first car, and he asked if he could come in. I let him in. He sat at the kitchen table. Enid made tea, because that's who Enid is. And then she went into the garden so we could talk. Desmond said he was sorry. He said Harriet had been going through a difficult time at work. He said he hadn't known how to handle the situation. He said he'd been embarrassed because the business had been struggling for nearly 2 years now. The consultancy he'd started with my inheritance money had not, it turned out, quite worked out the way he'd hoped. He'd lost a major client in 2021. He'd overextended on the property in Pakuranga. Harriet's salary was holding them together. And Harriet, he said, found it difficult to feel generous towards parents, who she perceived as needing help. He said all of this looking at the table. Then he said, "Dad, I know this is a lot to ask, but I've been thinking. The Titirangi house. It's just the two of you, in 4 bedrooms. If you sold it and bought something smaller." I stopped him. I said, "Desmond, look at me." He looked up. I said, "In 2014, your mother and I gave you $1.9 million. We did it because we loved you and because we believed in you. We were wrong not to love you, but to believe that money was the right way to show it. We took something away from ourselves to give to you. And what we took away wasn't the money. It was the chance to be needed by you. We turned ourselves, without knowing it, into people you would never have to think about again." He started to cry. I kept going, "Kitsu, or I wouldn't have got through it." I said, "Your mother has survived cancer twice. She is the bravest person I have ever known. She raised you with love and patience and a kind of fierce hope that I never quite understood. And she sat across a restaurant table from you on Mother's Day and listened to your wife describe her as a burden. You nodded, son. You nodded." He was sobbing by then. I said, "I forgive you. Your mother will forgive you too, because that's who she is. But something has to change, and it won't be us selling our house. It will be you, Desmond. You learning who we are. You making room in your life for us the way we made room in ours for you. And you'll do it without Harriet. Because Harriet is not welcome in this house until I see, with my own eyes, a woman who understands what she did." He nodded. He couldn't speak. He stayed for 2 hours. He sat with his mother in the garden and cried some more. Before he left, he wrote out a check and put it on the kitchen table. It was for $100,000. He said it wasn't a repayment. He said he didn't have $1.9 million anymore, and he didn't know if he ever would. But it was what he had, and he wanted us to have it. I didn't cash the check for 3 weeks. I wanted to be sure I was doing it with the right heart. Then I took it to the bank, and I put most of it into a term deposit for Enid's medical care, and I used a small amount to hire back one of my old cabinet makers part-time, a good fellow named Waimauku who'd been driving taxis after the workshop went quiet. We met Mariana Paraone the following weekend. She drove down from Wangare with her husband and her 2 boys, the older one 6 years old. Serious-eyed, solemnly introduced himself as Arthur Paraone and shook my hand. Mariana hugged me for a long time. She hugged Enid longer. She said her father had never stopped talking about the man from the crash, and she'd grown up believing that the world had good people in it because one of them had pulled her out of a burning car when she was 4 years old. Enid and Mariana have wrung each other every Sunday since. Mariana's boys came down for the school holidays in July and stayed in Desmond's old bedroom. Enid taught the younger one, who's 4, how to roll out pastry. He called her Nana Enid by the end of the week. And Enid, for the first time since her diagnosis, looked like a woman who had a future again. Harriet, I am told, filed for divorce in September. I don't know the details, and I don't want to. Desmond is living in a small flat in Grey Lynn now. He has dinner with us every second Sunday. And he brings groceries. And he washes the dishes afterwards without being asked. Last month, he sat in my workshop for an afternoon and watched me dovetail a drawer, and he asked me, for the first time in his adult life, how I'd learned to do it. I told him my father taught me, and I told him I'd teach him, if he wanted. He said he did. I'm 67 years old. I have been a husband for 41 years, a father for 37, a cabinetmaker for nearly 50. I have learned a few things along the way, and I want to share them with you now, because if you've listened this far, perhaps there's a reason you needed to hear it. The first thing I want to tell you is this: do not give your children their inheritance while you are still alive. Not all of it. Not most of it. Not even half of it. I don't say that out of bitterness. I say it because money given too early is not a gift, it is a release from obligation. It teaches the receiver that the giver has already done their part, and it robs both of you of the years you could have spent needing each other. Keep enough to live on with dignity. Keep enough to be ill with dignity. Keep enough that your children must still wonder about you, must still ring you, must still remember that you are a person and not simply a resource. The second thing I want to tell you is that silence, at the right moment, is louder than any shout. I did not raise my voice in that restaurant. I did not accuse. I did not lecture. I did not weep. I ate my meal, and I held my wife's hand, and I let the world turn, and the world, in its own time, turned. There is a difference between weakness and patience. A patient man is not a weak one. He is simply a man who has learned that most of what matters will sort itself out if you do not spoil it with your own noise. The third thing I want to tell you is that the small kindnesses you do when no one is watching, the stranger you help on the road, the extra hour you stay at a job site to finish a thing properly, the phone call you make to an old friend who is ill, these are the seeds of your later years. I did not pull Mariana Parawan out of a burning car because I thought it would matter one day. I did it because she was 4 years old, and I had hands and a crowbar. But that small act, done and forgotten, came back across 3 decades to stand between my wife and humiliation on the one night we could not have borne it alone. Be careful what you do in private. Be even more careful what you fail to do. The fourth thing, and the hardest: forgive your children, even when they do not deserve it, because they are still becoming the people they will one day be. Desmond is not who he was at that restaurant table, and he is not yet who he might become. None of us are. The door you leave open is the door your children will one day walk back through, and the door you close in anger is the one they will spend the rest of their lives standing outside of. I will not close my door on my son, not because what he did was small, it wasn't, but because what I am is larger than what he did. And the last thing I want to say is this: if you are a wife or a husband or a partner to someone who has been hurt by their own family, sit close to them tonight. Take their hand. Tell them they are not a burden. Tell them they never have been. Enid fell asleep on my shoulder in the car on the drive home that night, and I drove the last 20 minutes with my arm around her. And I thought, whatever else happens, this woman will never again hear the word "her" said about her the way it was said at that table. Not while I am breathing. She is in the garden as I finish telling you this. She is planting silver beet because she believes in the future now, and because Mariana's little boys are coming down next weekend, and they love it with butter. The sun is out. There is a tui in the kohai tree outside the window. My hands are a little stiffer than they used to be, but they still know what they know, and there is a drawer on my bench that needs finishing before lunch. If you are listening from somewhere in this country or somewhere across the water, tell me where you are. Tell me your mother's name, if she is still with you, and if she is not, tell me something she taught you, something small, something that has lasted. I will read every comment. I always do. Kia ora, and thank you for staying until the end.